introduction, I try to give you a small insight on the everyday events of a queer woman's life in Lebanon. I need to know that I don't claim on any level that I represent all the queer women in Lebanon. Just keep that note in mind. Oh no, not again. A couple of friends and I thought to ourselves, not one more episode about homosexuality. But here it was, being advertised on TV titled المثلية الجنسية مرض أو موضة homosexuality, a fashion or a disease. The sense of annoyance with TV episodes about homosexuality that are run on various local Lebanese TV channels come from a recurrent experience of misrepresentation of queer people's lives in them. These episodes are run on various channels and are mostly a copy from one another. Such episodes drown society with stereotypes of victimization and categorical essentialization of gays and lesbians in Lebanon. And most of the time, as well, mix between a trans woman and a gay man. That's how much in the research they are. Regardless if the person tries to explain. Questions such as, were you born this way? And so on are asked. In these episodes, mostly hosts rarely give the chance to deeply touch on any of the issues about sexuality and homosexuality. And sexuality is mostly treated as a tool to harvest viewers, thus using queer women and men's private lives in order to make money. It's not a surprise for how capitalism profits from our bodies. The Lebanese media, as Sarah Murad argues, since the Lebanese Civil War was over, opened the issue of sexuality in order to move away from opening the issue of sectarianism and its bloody history on TV. Since then, the issue of homosexuality became a tool for scoops, and the LGBTIQ personnel lives became a commodity in which these media outlets capitalize, collecting viewers with a sexy topic. The episodes about homosexuality on each channel usually host archetypes of personals that are standard. First, there's a psychologist that is analyzing if homosexuality is normal or not. Given that the simple Google search will give you that answer. Second, there's a priest and the sheikh, two very powerful clergies, again, imposing their views on queer women, telling them what their vaginas should like and what it shouldn't, in the name of God. These clergies are there in order to give the religious argument, which is most of the time, you are all going to burn in hell, kind of argument, with nuances, of course. And there's the homosexual. The homosexual body is usually a feminine guy that fits the stereotype of an effeminate gay man. Not that this is bad, but what I mean by pointing this out is indicating that a certain gender is attributed to gay men, thus limiting the representation to only this gender identity and marginalizing the other varieties of other gender identities. Also, rarely a lesbian woman, which usually should fit a certain stereotype of masculinity as well, if she ever agrees to show her face, which is very rare happening. Usually the gay men in the episodes are more open to show their faces for various reasons that I cannot identify. Otherwise, I will be drowning you with assumptions. On the other hand, the queer feminist women community for 7 years have evolved in a sense that it divorced itself from identity politics and realized that injustice against women who sleep with women is not only based on sexuality, but on a larger system of oppression that has to do with a social and economical structure that creates a very fertile ground for such violence. Realizing that structural violence is indeed structural, and that emancipation begins with deconstructing the root cause of injustice on an intersectional level of class, sex, race, sexuality, and gender. Therefore, the image goes as such. There's the Lebanese media that is constantly trying to represent homosexuality based on identity politics and politics of victimization or criminalization, while at the same time, the involvement of the queer politics adopted by queer feminist women are being perpetually deconstructed, very far away from the way the media is representing homosexuality or even sexualities in general, including queer sexualities. For example, straight women who sleep with men outside of marriage, which is something as well illegal in Lebanon. Therefore, as media discursively tries to fit sexualities and relate it to identity politics and base the oppression essentially on being a homosexual, part of the queer feminist community is stuck with multiple frontiers. One that have a fight with the media, that does not hold it lightly, that their image is being represented as one they cannot identify with, and feel that their privacy is constantly breached. On another frontier with society, that itself has become a police of our sexualities. Few weeks ago, I was in a party with friends. My friend had short hair, but she was not gay. Sometimes in Lebanon, short hair became an indication of whether you're a lesbian or not. And she was with a group of queer women. During the party, she was approached by a guy who asked her, "Are you a lesbian?" She pretended that she did not hear him. Then he proceeded to ask her, "Are you with these girls?" "Yes," she said, "I am with them." So he went away. Luckily, he went away. But our anxieties didn't. This is the frontier I'm talking about. People as a morality police. The way society perceives queerness is very complex. On one hand, queer women have a couple of bars where they can gather, party, drink, and so on. But eventually, these bars become populated with older heterosexual men. Some of these men do not take the queer woman's sexuality seriously. Therefore, they constantly try to hit on them in lesbian spaces. Moreover, there's always the traditional question asked in the everyday regarding the gender identities of these women. The confusion, is this a girl or a boy? For women who do not conform to the normative gender identities of what's imposed on them to be counted as a woman. Then there's a gender police among each other. The "are you sure you are a lesbian" question for women who are feminine. The aforementioned question is not so popular anymore, though, among the queer feminist women, and this is what I mean by evolution of politics, because of the constant conversation about stereotypes and gender identities that certain lesbian communities have engaged in for the past 7 years. So even though assumptions about victimization by the social and the political can be made about queer feminist women in Lebanon because of the frontiers they are fighting in their everyday, a big part of the queer community refuses this victim category and cannot identify with it. Thus, the feeling of oppression is turned into a general allergy against injustice and a profound rethinking of its root cause. Therefore, in resistance to the above, a few years ago, a group of queer women was formed. Some of you have heard about it. The group was called MEME. MEME started as a support group of LGBTIQ women. Then almost 2 years later, the collective core members went on a retreat and decided to shift from a support group to become a movement. MEME's most significant achievements were the book Beirut Mustajel, Male in a Hurry, and the queer Arab Zine, Bakhsus. You can still find Bakhsus online, by the way. But what is more significant about MEME as well, is its internal political diversity. So there were those who support BDS, mostly on the leadership side, and those who sadly don't. Those who identify as queer feminists, and those who don't. And like any other collective, because of its internal and external ideological clashes, leadership, and many other reasons, those who are left to take in charge of MEME decided to close it down for many reasons. MEME became a place where some people use its name in order to harvest funding and fame among the international community, but does nothing in real life. But since the group was collectively managing MEME at the end of its days, and given that they were very aware of politics of representation, and the importance of writing our oral histories. Meme is now in the process of writing its own history, and probably will be soon publishing a historical narrative about what happened. Now, given the contesting factors regarding the existence of a big lesbian community in Lebanon, even though there's a penal code that criminalizes homosexuality, also the fact that meme, for example, was visible and not visible at the same time, had a community house and a very strong existence online, especially via Bakhsous, makes the community look very interesting for researchers. The researchers, whether based in the West or even diasporas, for a long time tried to take a peek at the inside of the lesbian community in Lebanon, to the extent that at some point our sexuality became similar to a queer eclipse. It was obviously perceived as so complex and rare that almost everybody wanted to look at it and write about it. Along the years, in the beginning, some of queer women allowed researchers, journalists, filmmakers, what have you not, to interview them, and then eventually got frustrated by the outcome, that at some point they simply refused to give any interview to anyone anymore. Queer women's sexuality via this ecliptic gaze became an epistemological tool academics capitalized on in order to build their privileged academic ivory tower empires of fame. What is sexier than being an expert on lesbians in the Middle East? Some researchers call Lebanon by its name, even the place where it most happens, Beirut, while other researchers simply call it the Middle East, reducing the complexity of such queer community, their everyday lives and our histories, to a hegemonic lump of a geographical location. Researchers, sometimes even, and sorry to say that, become stalkers. Being a queer woman in Lebanon mostly means being constantly anxious about a sexuality that is criminalized by law and demonized by society. The last thing a queer woman needs is to get an email telling her, "Oh, hello, I'm a researcher and you are a lesbian, so let's talk." Friends from my circle got a lot of such emails. "Hello, I'm a PhD scholar, you are a lesbian, can we meet in order to interview you?" These people allowed themselves to invade the privacy of their lives and sexual practices in order to talk, research them. These academics are usually strangers, not taking into consideration the paranoia that comes with such emails. Who is this person? Why does he have my name and family name? Who else knows that this woman is queer? What if, and so on. But the problem with research does not stop at invasion of privacy and stalking the lesbian eclipse. It as well extends to production of knowledge about it. The problem with researching sexualities and communities without understanding their surrounding is a limit that research from the West, be it diasporas or Westerns, need to understand. For example, understanding how the texture of sectarianism managed to sneak in a highly non-sectarian spaces, such LGBTIQ and queer movement in Lebanon, makes it a limit in order to understand the dynamics between these communities. The history of our modes of organization, internal and external clashes, indicate a high sense of othering to the extent that communities, in my personal opinion, have had similar texture to sects, where they communicate among each other in very dysfunctional manners. One day getting along, the other fighting, and if you are on one team, then the other team automatically becomes your enemy. If any of you is familiar with these patterns of Lebanese organizing, these patterns of clashes are similar to the pattern of political sectarian parties. Even though the civil war in Lebanon supposedly ended, the Taif confessional system have become a sort of how NGO and movement mostly organize, always needing an other in order to lead. This is only one example of how complex it is to write and research the Lebanese queer community. And by complex, I don't mean exceptional, but as complex as any other community. Finally, it is very easy for researchers to sit in their epistemological ivory towers and tell us what to do with our lives, just like the government, politicians, and clergymen do. But what is really challenging is try to capture the complexity of queer communities and their everyday. Moreover, discussing it not as a rare view, but as a part of a bigger context that reproduces it. It would be very helpful for researchers that are interested in queer women's sexuality in Lebanon to try and stay in the country for more than a couple of months and engage with the people on the ground, listen to what they have to say. Most importantly, researchers need to realize that their message of chasing queer women around and asking them to talk to them when they never met that researcher in their whole lives is problematic. It would be helpful to spend more time in the country and allow the encounters to be organic rather than clinical. Also, it must be noted that while writing about homosexuality and its criminalization, to be very careful not to reduce its complexity to colonialism and stop attributing all of our oppression to colonialism. Just because 534 was imported from the French, it would have not survived if the social was not so accepting of it. I will not fool myself or you and tell you that the points I touch upon here are everything that should be discussed, or that in 15 minutes presentation I will be able to touch upon all the issues. But I hope that my intervention at least captured some of the complexities of being a queer feminist woman in Lebanon. Also, I have to insist that I am not here to speak on the behalf or represent any community, but what I shared with you is a mere observation of how I perceive the experience of queer women in Beirut. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya. Our next speaker is Jared McCormick, who is a PhD candidate in anthropology at Harvard.
Hi, is this okay? Position? Some of you have had an echo. So I wanted to start first by thanking Syed and Barbara, and as these conferences go, everyone else behind the scenes that makes it happen. I also just wanted to start by acknowledging a lot of the other scholars and people working at NGOs, activists that are not here, but that are a critical part of these conversations. So I'm taking this conference to be a welcome departure from a traditional academic conference. So I wanted to start just by giving an introduction to my work and then pose some broad questions focusing on one part of my dissertation. So my larger work is focused on questions of mobility and sexuality in the context of Beirut concerning men. And as many of you know, given this long history of mobility, specifically in the context of Lebanon, or immobility, there are a lot of different categories and ways that these movements have really structured society. So one thing that I have become very interested in over the years, particularly more in the beginning of my PhD, was, and I always go like this with my fingers, is kind of this, I'll do one of these academic hand gestures, is a layering of these demographics of mobile bodies in Lebanon. And I think Lebanon is a great place to think theoretically about movement and mobility. So one thing that I have tried to do with my work in the first few years was to really kind of problematize not just the role of sexuality and mobility, but also the inverse of that in thinking about mobility in determining how sexuality kind of plays out and the complications of it. If I were to take a cue from Sofian in his new book, Queer Beirut, in one way I'm trying to deal with part of these different demographics and hierarchies of relationship of men. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of that, I mean, there's a demographic of Syrian men who we might think of as migrant workers, not as tourists. There are questions of sex work, complicated ideas of the Syrian male body, the figure of the Syrian male in Lebanon. Gulf men, perhaps coming with their families, alone, a la style of the international gay. Some that have their villas in the mountains where they keep many boys in wait. There's the very complicated category of the diaspora. So someone from America, who's half Lebanese, someone from Brazil, who's third generation Lebanese, a Lebanese who went to university in Lebanon and now lives in the Gulf and comes back. And as some of you might know from an article that I published a few years ago, organized tours that have since stopped. So needless to say, this is a big mix of different nationalities, different men that are coming. But one thing that I'm actually trying to unpack in these groups of non-heterosexual men, be that acts, identities, or desires, is actually not just their categories of movement, but the way in which there is a creation and idea of place, right? And this is where I think kind of this cue of the name of the conference, this imagination, really connects with my own work. So, in the last few years, as I'm in the 8th year of my PhD, so there's been a lot of thinking going on. As I was trying to put together the ethnography, there was something emergent which pushed me down a path in the last 2.5 years, which really was how these early conceptions of Beirut, based on an imagination of this place, based on the media's portrayal of it, were very profound in the way in which people were coming to identify a certain set of expectations and emotions around Lebanon today. And really what I'm talking about is the tourism industry. So just to signal something that I think a lot of you might know, there was this article a couple years ago that Beirut was the province town of the Middle East. And that article, as well as many of the others that you see, kind of posits Lebanon as this very liberal, permissive, cosmopolitan. We can come up with all of these air quote words of these sentiments and emotions that are around it, but this is nothing new, because Lebanon was kind of always repackaged and rewrapped in these same sentiments in what became a very profound part, I would argue, of this narrative through the tourism industry. So I'm not, I guess in a large part of my work, I'm not doing the history of tourism, but I'm trying to think about a cloud, a constellation of these issues which connect, which actually build a direction and a narrative which became very important for these representations of Lebanon, and then in the ethnography today of how that actually affects people's expectation of Lebanon. So this has been, in the last 2 years, all archival work around how the tourism industry functioned, what it was, who it hailed, what kinds of infrastructure it provided, and advertisements around it and guidebooks. And I think as a lot of you will know, academic work, at least on Lebanon, gets stuck in what I call kind of the tractor beam of the Civil War. And I'm not saying that it isn't important and profound, but there's so much social history and political economy and decades of life in Lebanon that still has not kind of properly been connected and brought out. So I'm thinking about the tourism industry actually not as a full history, but in three kind of veins. And one of these I will talk about apart. So one is kind of the circulation of a visual culture, which became realized through specifically the genre of postcards. So this, the metonym of mobility itself on a representation of place. And another chapter is actually dealing with hotels and the excitement around the construction and the blurring of the public and the private space that became kind of centered on a certain kind of consumption. And a chapter from which my comments, which I'm about to start, come from, which I'm calling the Anthropology of a Season, which really approaches this idea of the summertime in Lebanon as not just an imagination, not just a time period, but it's actually a space which kind of came to center in the mountains in Lebanon, even from the 1850s onwards. But really what I would like you to think about in my comments here is that in tourism, what became very foundational is not, my work is dealing with, let's say, male sexuality and an imagination of place. And sometimes I'll talk to someone and they'll say, okay, well, Was there gay tourism in Lebanon in the 1950s? Okay, I mean, there's certain accounts of that, but actually what I'm not concerned with is sexuality per se, but to actually flip this and say there was a certain kind of sensuality which was created of Lebanon that I think had tucked into it notions of an expectation and a sexuality. So in that there was a privileging of the senses through our body, and our bodies were stimulated through this idea of the tourism industry. So from the turn of the century, many villages that flank Beirut became tourist destinations, well known for their natural endowments, but more specifically, summertime destinations for privileged Lebanese, visiting foreign nationals, and the wealthy and famous of the region. Various villages enthusiastically tried to replicate the resort economy model that became successful in Alay, Hamdoun, Sofar, as well as many others, not just as a way of financial development, but as an avenue to modernize. Across the sides of the mountain, hotels were created, private homes were converted, furnished apartments and villas were sold, and land was also sold at ever-increasing prices. But what I propose in my comments here, which is a much smaller part of an argument I make in a chapter, is that this interrelationship of summering, and just to be very clear here, when I say summering, I'm talking about an older idea of packing up the whole family, going somewhere else for the entire summer. So this isn't just simply a vacation. It would be 2 months, 3 months. And for those of you that might not know the specific kind of the context of Lebanon, summering was something that ran in tandem with tourism. So siyaha, the tourism, and istiyaf, the summering, but they were actually considered separate kind of markets, separate entities by the government, and most of the writing that talks about this. So this interrelationship of summering, of tourism, and the senses, which became realized through a season that was marked by growing mobility. As greater movements developed through immigration, transit, and trade, the summering industry grew roots, deep and wide, from which the tourism industry, siyaha, would later emerge after independence, specifically in the 50s with mass tourism. What grew from this came to structure parts of the Lebanese economy, guided internal narratives of the nation, recast the significance of Lebanon to the region, and piggybacked onto certain visions of nationalism and belonging to the growing diaspora. In this way, as tourism and summering were central factors to the imagination of what Lebanon was, the summer itself was a vehicle in which they both rode. Much summer and temporary movement to the mountain slopes was first realized for a health concern, right? So think cholera, think health issues of that concern. But there were also, there was a Lebanese memoir from 1854, and he says, quote, "Your brain will melt if you stay in Beirut in the summer." But gradually this became more centered on a sensibility through comfort, consumption, and class. And certain mountain villages became focal points of increasing wealth and playgrounds to the elite in the region. Yet these undercurrents of summering and tourism were highly contingent on the types of bodies hailed to arrive under the auspices of certain expectations and bound by certain class and nationality limitations. Who was granted access, arrival, and welcome? And through a distribution of the sensible, or what I call here just simply the sensible, this underlined, quote, a condition of possibility for perception, thought, and activity, what it is possible to apprehend by the senses. So as I said before, while my larger research and dissertation are concerned with issues of gender and specifically male sexuality, what I would like to offer for consideration here is actually something somewhat simple in premise, but as I said, extremely profound in how it came to form different channels in narratives and specifically stereotypical ideas of Lebanon, and that is this sensuality. And in this sensuality, there was a rhythm of the summer which linked the senses to a series of emotions, as well as to a movement, right? So I'm talking about your body moving, your body in the mountains, your body at the pool, this is this linking of a physical and a social and an imaginative realm. This was This was the case for many of these villages perched above, but always within reach of Beirut. And at the core of this attraction was an increasing pull of consumption, indexing an idea of modernity, enjoyment, and pleasure-seeking. I'm going to skip this part. So, Chambers, writing on Edward Said's work from Cultural and Imperialism, noted that our lives are trapped, as it were, in the narratives and, quote, boundaries of imaginary geographies in which what is available is not truth as an absolute, a historical measure of the world, but a constructed series of representations. Thus, the taste of the food on the picnic by the springs, the crowds at the beauty pageants, the breeze on the veranda of the summer night, or the sounds of the roulette wheel spinning, and these are all kind of drawn from either guidebooks or journalists or memoirs. They all index a cloud of a sense of the summer in the mountains, which was accessible to few, but became quite known to many, and also quite linked to a narrative of a meaning of a place. And these constructions of place through various types of mobility linked a certain types of leisure and consumption, which still remain today, and which is why I've spent 2.5 years trying to go back and form some part of this connection to the ethnography today. So in just the couple minutes that are left, I wanted to just give you guys an actual sense of the senses here. So many travel logs and guidebooks lent the reader to think that Lebanon's extraordinary beauty was to be matched on an equal scale in terms of comfort, fun, and style. So in 1911, an Egyptian noted the suburbs of Beirut with berries, orange trees, and a breeze that brought up, quote, the fragrance of the flowers that heals a sick body, end quote. In developing this physical and imaginative landscape, a consumer, a tourist, a summerer, a desired body was created over the decades, just as a narrative of Lebanon was fostered. From health to enjoyment, quote, the swimming pool and the wide garden surrounding it make the hotel the most enjoyable place, end quote, in the mountains of Lebanon. The Lebanese, quote, are becoming extremely prosperous and are exploiting the beautiful climate and scenery of their mountain home for a summer resort. And indeed, it is becoming more and more popular among the richer Syrians and Egyptians to spend the summer months there enjoying the mountain air. End quote, that's from 59. The scenery and the seasons connected directly to experiences through the senses. Quote, it is a fact that no other Eastern Mediterranean city approaches it, Beirut, in wide open, uninhibited appeal to the pleasure senses, end quote, that's from 63. This stimulation was linked to and built by a real and imagined sensuality of Lebanon. And I'm really kind of inspired by Rancière and this distribution of the sensible in kind of underlying part of this argument. So there was another beautiful guidebook from 38, and it was directed specifically to Egyptians. And it was actually, I guess we would call it a yearbook or a gazette. So it had all of these pictures of people that would summer in Lebanon, and they would write a testimony. So included here was the Egyptian Undersecretary of the Ministry of Education, the Director of the Ministry of the Interior, the Supervisor of Girls' Education in Egypt, the Director of the Bank of Egypt, the uncle of the Queen of Egypt who had spent the last 40 summers in Lebanon, and many more. One author wrote, quote, it was the beauty of the Lebanese that was superior. Hassan Mohammed Hussein, who was a member of the representatives in Egypt, pondered from Alay in 1938, quote, what is the most beautiful thing you see in Lebanon? Is it the springs from the tops of the mountains and its fresh water or pine forest? Or views of vineyards and trees scattered in the heights of the mountains and valleys? Or the fresh air, or its residents who are characterized by decent morals? Everything is beautiful in Lebanon, end quote. So, I mean, this sensibility and the way in which the senses become stimulated changes over time. So those ones were a little bit older. Edward Said, who spent the majority of his childhood summers in Lebanon, in Shued, noted, quote, as they were passing through Sofar, another very well-known submarine destination. Quote, "The elegant gardens surrounded by all sorts of meticulously dressed, distinguished guests, among whom my parents would point out an Egyptian pasha or two, a former Syrian cabinet member, a super wealthy Iraqi industrialist, a Jewish department store owner." He continues by saying that actually these resort villages were, quote, "different and unique. They made up a core that basically gave Lebanon its prestige as a submarine destination, and which, along with its splendid peaches, figs, mulberries, and plums, its legions of white-jacketed waiters with names like Edouard, Georges, Joseph, Pierre, Nicolas, its promenades, boutiques, pine forest, and steeply inclined roads made Lebanon unique in the Arab world. So I can keep kind of going on, and in this period in the 50s and the 60s, I guess to kind of sum up really what I'm trying to think about and unpack and kind of throw out to you guys is first an appreciation of my work coming through contemporarily thinking of men and this imagination of Lebanon, and many of them saying, it is a very free, cosmopolitan, liberal place, one that might be the gay capital of the Middle East. And again, trying to think about the narratives on which they have kind of based this, a certain expectation of what Lebanon is. And so I guess in its most kind of summated form, what I'm saying is to think about, rather than sexuality, I would say we need to think about sensuality in the development of mobility in Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. Now I feel very, very nostalgic, having spent my summers in those villages. Okay, our final speaker is Sofian Merabet, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at UT Austin.
So we'll try to prevent that from happening, you becoming nostalgic. I will move a little bit from beauty to maybe some uglier shades. But before that, I would like to, you can't hear me? No. You can? Closer, should eat it. Maybe it's not working. But before that, I would like to thank Saad for this wonderful get-together in this very glorious space, and I feel partly intimidated by these eyes looking upon us. This being said, I would like to talk today to you about what I refer to as homosexual homophobia, arrogant looks, and the queer encounter in Lebanon. An urban environment such as that of the Lebanese capital, Beirut, contains all sorts of zones of intersecting encounters and correspondences, which different inhabitants of the city assign to specific places at particular times. In turn, these places, be they clearly marked social venues or partly hidden sites, become appropriated and varyingly interpreted by a range of individuals and groups. My intent here is to show that in post-Civil War Lebanon, the representations of productive relations in spatial discourse do not only encompass relations of state and governmental power, they also always reflect a variety of alternative potencies, including, but not limited to, queer ones that become crystallized within the larger context of their own dynamic representations. The spatial setting of such representations is related, for example, to a presumably random road intersection, entire neighborhoods, or even a variety of particular buildings scattered around the city. Therefore, while the formality of frontal relations in Lebanon is often brutal and based not just on the state and sectarian power structures, but also on an assortment of less easily distinguishable social authorities related to class and status, this formality never completely manages to prohibit individual activities that are remotely transgressive or perhaps even outright clandestine and underground. For example, there are the various appropriations of the cafe or nightclub, where the clientele changes from day to night times, tuning itself into the continuous flow of a spatial and temporal tournament of value. These representations are constantly shifting, and they convert frontal relations of production and reproduction into informal signs and codes that are prone to being heavily contested and struggled over. Spaces of representations, like social hubs, are the best incarnations of what Henri Lefebvre called lived spaces, for a more general, even far from all-inclusive public. It is parts of these spaces that also present complex and sometimes contradictory symbolisms associated with the intricate social processes of ascertaining a queer presence in Lebanon. The assertion of such a presence, I would like to argue, goes mostly hand in glove with generalized mechanisms of projection and defense.
There's been a request.
Okay. Let's see whether this is better. I was saying that the assertion of such a presence goes mostly hand in glove with generalized mechanisms of projection and defense, such as the exhibition of arrogance, indifference, and aloofness. All of these generally form an integral part of what I would like to term as a Beiruti mirror stage within the larger context of the sociocultural repertoire of human interaction in Lebanon. Indeed, to recognize people, a happenstance hardly to be avoided in such a minuscule country, does not mean that person A has to acknowledge person B outright. Quite the opposite is the case. You can easily talk to a person at a particular time and in a particular place. However, once those temporal and spatial coordinates have shifted, the exact causes that may generate such a shift notwithstanding, the same person can refrain from looking at you altogether. Instead, he looks at himself. Tensions between the potential quest of long-lasting attention and the contradictory display of arrogance toward others are part of the daily realities in Beirut, of which many are quite tragic. Repression and disavowal, as well as the conceptual divide in the propagation of ideals that exoticize some over others, often result in an individual suffering that is founded on the collective effort by many gay men in Lebanon to accommodate impotence. I would argue that the particular conjectures, ranging from the larger context of paternalism to the notorious politics of aloofness and the rampant internalization of homophobia, partly delineate the probing conundrum of what I would like to call here the homosexual encounter. To a great extent, it is precisely these conjectures that are responsible for the selective politics of exclusion and inclusion. For instance, to display a demeanor generally understood as feminine or effeminate is far from having to be interpreted as a detrimental transgression per se. At specific times and in certain situations, transgression may even be welcomed by many social protagonists. Yet, the event of a favorable circumstance notwithstanding, such potentially transgressive behavior, providing it is perceived as increasing in visibility, will undoubtedly turn into the declared target of a mentally and sometimes physically violent internalized homophobia. To analyze thoroughly the homosexual sphere in Beirut translates not only into the importance of emphasizing Lebanese group dynamics along with their individual crystallizations, but also into a close look at the spatial context of the capital city itself, where, mediated by the many convolutions of a particular social world, geography ends up orchestrating desire. It is a context in which identities are perpetually formulated and appropriated in all kinds of ways. What these identities have in common is visual recognition. Before forming the function of the eye, that is to say, any subject in general or the gay body in particular, a mirror transplanted onto the microsocial stage of Beiruti narcissism always forms first and foremost the function of the eye. Whether it is within the spatial confines of a bathhouse or within an open space like Beirut's Corniche, the complex practices of steady looks and gazes remain paramount. Any kind of encounter is always initiated by the integral activation of understated gulps and gapes that selectively screen the familiar faces of those who, for example, pass a specific stretch of the Corniche at a specific moment. The gaze, in short, evaluates the respective party according to his or her timely relevance to the gazing protagonist. Such a timely relevance can be projected upon others, but it is also often projected upon oneself, whereby the individual assumes a position of what is suggestively called in Lebanese Arabic, shofat al-hal, literally the state of looking at oneself, a state of mind that roughly translates into arrogance, and a strong feeling of self-importance, also referred to as attitude in English-speaking quarters. It is a state that distinguishes its practitioners from everybody else, but it also links them to a generalized performance of conceit and haughtiness, from which to separate oneself remains a difficult task due to peer pressure and the fear of exclusion. In an analogy with Lacan's mirror stage, I'm haunted here by the image of a concept I'm not using for analytic, let alone clinical purposes, but because of the wide circulation of it that it has experienced, rather, over the past couple of years within the homosexual sphere in Lebanon. And this is a concept of the, again in Arabic, mafsumin, loosely and perhaps misleadingly translated into schizophrenic gay men. So mafsumin look at themselves, a visual fetish of sorts, to compensate for a lack that intrigues me, especially given the context in which they are busy checking out some while ignoring others. This applies to the goings-on in a hammam, where prestige, respect, and status are momentarily acquired by the right attitude, namely one that is based on an elaborate performance of a distancing arrogance in which one sees oneself in the complex hall of mirrors of Lebanese vanities. The latent suggestive nature of gazes is thus usually coupled with evocative bodily postures that become manifest in those instances when the individuals involved mutually recognize, through the sharing of certain encoded performances, that they all hustle and feitin bil-jaw, which essentially translates are all concerned and part of what is understood to be the gay atmosphere. The performance of arrogance, and thus infisam shakhsi, namely schizophrenia for the lack of a better word, is always based on instances of a gazing recognition that only becomes apparent within the concrete spatial context. In being appropriated, this context facilitates the construction and contestation of individual and group identities that are based on the capacity of the body to fragment and reconstitute itself. This context forecloses and permits the fragmentation of the body along with the various identities attached to it. Yet it does so not only by making sense of it through language and the use of actual words, but also through a whole set of complex bodily performances of which the gaze is just one, albeit pivotal, component. The image of Beirut as a buzzing, unsettling, and ever-thrilling playground of hyper-animated people and streaming automobiles is the context par excellence in which any number of cultures and spheres are produced, appropriated, and unremittingly contested. As a consequence, my space is, in a way, the context of which I would be the text. Both my body as well as my body's other are intrinsically linked to the different reflections and shadows that their respective spaces project. The moving intersections in Beirut that touch, reach, threaten, or favor my body, as well as the other bodies, form a common zone that can ultimately facilitate the encounter between myself and the other. This common zone is undoubtedly shaped by the inherent fragmented nature of the body and allows for gaps and tensions, contacts and cuts. It repeats and yet creates a difference that down the road may constitute an altogether alternative space where encounters between different individuals become possible. Through this opening up, disidentifications, to borrow a notion from the late José Muñoz, are formed by allowing the negotiation and potential transformation of the dominant culture. This space comes to be lived in its profundities that are themselves composed of repetitions, echoes, and repercussions. Despite recurrent claims that nahna open-minded, we are open-minded in Lebanese Arabic, the common self-denial among gay men, which in a country like Lebanon usually translates further into the widely uttered phrase, "ana mish hik," I'm not like that, is often coupled with the generalized rejection of what is perceived as difference. Regardless of whether it is idiosyncratic, this difference, or what is identified as such, always points to a stigma that is immutably attached to the other. This other is often perceived by a man who, for whatever reason, looks at himself, namely is arrogant, as some anachronistic and paradoxical representation that does not need to be engaged with as a coeval counterpart. Thus, as the likely preliminary result of a neurotic and therefore exceedingly frustrated performance, many gay individuals perceived by others as different give up the initial quest for visibility and self-assertion. Instead, these individuals often wind up opting for what I would call an invisible comeback. As opposed to recognizing, let alone accepting difference, some of these men indulge in the deceptive politics of normative mimicry, which leads to the undisputed and definitive outcome of a paramount fight toward the anticipated safety of social invisibility. In a country like Lebanon, such mimicry always takes place in conjunction with the overall social pressure imposed on many to conform to certain fixed social ideals and behaviors. In turn, the resulting anxiety often pushes the most genuine characters into the deceitful trap of social normativity, where the pitfalls tend to materialize in projected arrogance and psychological as well as sometimes physical aggression. This complex deployment of aggression and violence fosters relations of identity formations that are frontal and every so often overbearing to the single individual. It remains important, however, to stress the significance of a resulting zone of encounter that in itself is oppositional and contradictory in character. For that matter, the very word encounter presupposes a confrontation that indicates a conflict between two or more parties. Accordingly, following the prefix "n", the meaning of the linguistic element counter is based on the preposition against that generally denotes antagonism. Linguistically, this becomes manifest in the Romance languages, for instance, in the French translation rencontre. The verb sadafa, from which the feminine noun is derived, denotes primarily an action that emphasizes the movement of turning away from, avoiding, or even shunning the very person the encounter has produced in the first place. In stressing the importance of these linguistic connotations, I do not intend to argue that the various zones of encounter within the Lebanese male homosexual sphere are reduced to aggression, hostility, and resentment. After all, informed by chance, prospect, and opportunity, the related term sidfa, that is to say coincidence, points to the possibilities that always form an integral share of the larger equation. Nonetheless, the complex elements of tension, anxiety, and pressure remain part of an overall picture that illustrates the frontal and overpowering relations of alternative identity formations in Lebanon. The production of queer space there is equally connected to the orchestration of desire, which is based on individual and collective bodily performances, and which continuously highlights the transformative potential of the very notion of encounter. To actively engage in the appropriation of space, be it in the rather loose form of particular social venues, can further the emergence of a platform for what I call, with reference to Judith Butler here, the performative iteration, where the reiterative power of discourse produces the phenomena that it regulates and constrains. With a slight distinction from the original, I want to think of that platform as the very space where the Butlerian iterative formation of identities occurs not only through complex citational processes, but also through multifaceted performative bodily techniques that are spatially enacted, and in both cases, however, to challenge the discursive and oftentimes physical affirmation of the paramount powers of society, of which arrogance and its vicissitudes are but the tip of the iceberg, and this remains a difficult task, to say the least. And I still have something, but I'm out of time, so I will stop over here. Thank you.